Annie Oakley and Tag, Bad Bill and the Western Wildcat, Broncho Bill, Buster Crab, Comanche Moon, Cowgirl Romances, Kid Colt Outlaw, Rawhide Kid, Tumbleweeds. What, pray tell, are these referring to? Well, even if you didn't recognize them as the titles of Western-themed comics and comic books, you may well have noted a Western vibe. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink, and this month we speak with Dr. William Grady about his book, Redrawing the Western, A History of American Comics and the Mythic West. While there's no shortage of scholarship on how media formats like film and literature have contributed to the formation and evolution of Mythic West imagery, characters, storylines, and tropes, few have taken comics and comic books seriously. Grady makes a convincing case that they were central to 19th century Western mythologizing and 20th century usage of the West as a setting on which to stage stories with contemporary political relevance. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, here's a brief introduction to the podcast and myself. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and I'm a Professor of History. For better or worse, this podcast is a one-man operation. I'm the host, producer, sound engineer, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and I'll take just about any excuse to read more books and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. Each episode features a conversation with them, historians, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, sociologists, and others. The goal of these exchanges is to spark your curiosity, to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the people who have called it home. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes, or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please subscribe and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Share links with friends. Follow us on Facebook and X or Twitter, and send in feedback. At the end of this episode, I'll include some more information about my own scholarship and about the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. And with that, let me introduce who we are talking to this month and why. Dr. William Grady is an independent scholar and librarian based in the United Kingdom in Manchester. He earned a PhD in English from the University of Dundee and a Master's of Research and Bachelor of Arts in Film and Media Studies from Manchester Metropolitan University. He held a postdoctoral research post at the University of the Arts in London and has taught courses on comics, media theory, and film history at both the University of Dundee and Manchester Metropolitan University, where he now also works as a collections librarian. Our conversation with Dr. Grady is on his book, Redrawing the Western, A History of American Comics and the Mythic West, published by the University of Texas Press in 2024. Grady makes a compelling case that the medium of images plus words, be it in the form of illustrations, comics, comic books, or graphic novels, have been overlooked by cultural historians of the West and various other fields. In Redrawing the West, Grady traces the genre from the mid-19th century to the late 20th and identifies how various forms of comics were powerful factors in the formation of the imagery and tropes that we often refer to as the Mythic West in literature and film and other media. Perhaps discounted by contemporary cultural critics or later scholars due to the youth market they predominantly served, Grady shows how comics were not only central to those worlds, but often ahead of the curve in how they depicted the frontier West, both mythologizing it and deconstructing those myths. Faster and cheaper to produce than many other forms of media, they were also perhaps more ubiquitous and quickly reactive to contemporary affairs, very prone to using the West as a stage on which to tell sometimes thinly veiled tales of contemporary geopolitical events like the Cold War, American foreign interventionism, and more. As a cultural history of a visual medium, the book is understandably filled with illustrations and excerpts from comics. The University of Texas Press has really made a handsome volume here. This is a text that scholars of the West should take seriously. It adds much to our understanding of the region's mythic past and how Americans, and others, have made sense of it and deployed it to serve contemporary needs. Dr. William Grady, welcome to Writing Westward.
Thank you for having me today. I'm really looking forward to our little chat. So yeah, no, thanks. This is brilliant.
I think the first thing, and maybe this has happened in other interviews you've done as well, but our listeners are probably immediately going to be struck by your accent. You're from the UK, which prompts some pretty obvious first questions about like how did you become interested in the American West?
So yes, that is a very strange one, especially as well. I was born in sort of '89, so by the 1990s, I don't think this is unique to the United Kingdom, but the Western wasn't necessarily that huge kind of popular genre that it was in sort of, I guess, like the sort of mid-century, like 1950s. So yeah, I guess my kind of like way in was the kind of for want of a better word, the kind of exoticness of what the American West poses. It's that kind of cowboys and cactus. It's. I come from a town that rains all the time. It's grey. It's green, and by sort of comparison, in my head, I guess when you say the Western, you think of those sort of reds and the oranges of the deserts, the huge blue sky, all those sort of striking elements. And of course, I visited the American West. Went to Arizona when I was a kid in the late '90s, and we did all the tourist things. We didn't do anything. Well, we did other things, but the steam train ride up to the Grand Canyon, and it gets stopped by bandits. Of course, the trained actors, but it's all very Wild Westy. So it's very that. In truth, I would say that I didn't probably watch a great deal of westerns growing up. I think the one that sticks out as a child would probably have been Will Smith in Wild Wild West. I mean, because in '92 I would have been when Unforgiven was out. I would have been about 3 years old. So I guess a lot of the sort of the western content kind of passed me by. But there was that always that fascination. I will say for sure.
Did that come at the same time as an interest in comics and comic books?
I guess, and again, it's kind of the way they kind of married together came much later. I mean, as a kid, again, I was probably reading comics, but it wasn't like the only piece of media I consumed. I'm sure for other people, it was everything to read each week, so each month, Batman or Superman. I kind of read the occasional graphic novel here and there, but it was only actually when I got to university. I did a film and media studies course, and there was like a module on sort of American cinema, and that was kind of there was a I just remember the lecture where we did it on Unforgiven, and that was a kind of a milestone in a way that it made me realize. I mean, everyone's familiar with the kind of what the Western is, but that was the way it kind of breaks down the kind of the myths of the West as sort of masculinity and violence. It makes you realize actually there's more depth to just mere cowboys and cactus. There's these are sort of things that can tell like sort of quite challenging stories in ways I've not really thought about, because maybe the Western wasn't the kind of central, like, I love Westerns. And similar to sort of my exposure to comics at the same time, there was a module on comic studies. So it exposed me to things like Watchmen and Mouse and Persepolis and these sort of canonical works that, again, make you realize that, comics are more than just sort of superheroes. And again, there's much more depth. They tell lots of different stories. And so then kind of by third year of my undergraduate degree, I kind of realized I did want to go into academia. I wanted to sort of pursue sort of research into popular culture like an MA sort of study. And so my thesis kind of marries these kind of interests, because I realized I wanted to do comics for sure, but I realized no one's really looking at the American West, no one's really looking at the Western. And so it kind of paired these two things together. And I wanted to do everything. I wanted to do women in the Western, Indigenous American representation in comics. I kind of landed on this sort of mishmash thesis around sort of global West, post-West, and it was a bit of a mess. But I kind of realized I think you need to go back to basics, and someone needs to just write a history of American Western comics. And so from that kind of, this has been a bit of but from that kind of, we've finally hopefully got to the sort of PhD point where I'm kind of uniting all these different strands. And then this is where my monograph, Redrawing the Western, kind of came about. It was just like, I just want to write a history of American Western comics. There's so much more. I mean, the reviews are coming in now, and someone's like, I can't believe you didn't talk about this, and I can't believe you didn't say this. but this is hopefully just a start. And again, so if we had this conversation in 30 years' time, I'd waffle on much longer, because then there would be this and this and this. But it kind of, the way I landed on the sort of the why Western and why comics, it kind of, there was never like a key turning point. There was just little things along the way that kind of inspired to kind of pursue this, I guess.
I had a similar trajectory in that I did not grow up watching Westerns at all. It was not in my household, like no country music, no Western films. And, in my head, it was like this mythologized region of, cowboys and Indians. And I just didn't find that compelling. Although now, thinking critically about the mythology, I do find compelling. But as a kid, and even as an early college student, I was like, oh, that's not for me. But then you find out, oh, you actually can do some real critical work here, and it's deliciously messy, and there's a lot to chew on, more than I thought as a kid, at least.
No, definitely. I like totally. That is, it is very that. I think it is. I'd even say the Western wasn't even my dad's favorite genre. It was more like my granddad's thing, probably. So it is definitely generational, and that's not to speak for everyone, because I'm sure there is some diehard Western fans from that are my age and they've grown up watching them. But no, it definitely seemed sort of this. When I was younger, probably a bit tired and a bit outdated. But as you say, it is that kind of, you realize. I think the kind of the thing is the Western is so recognizable. It's just, it could be just those sort of the imagery of the sort of the cowboys, the cactus. I keep referring to cowboys and cactus. It could be those storylines and the myths around violence. It could be the kind of the visual spectacle. The grand deserts, or the galloping horses and gunfighting. But I think, because it's so, the simplicity of it, it's so recognizable that you could transfer that. You can watch a sort of television show, for example, and you see a man on the horseback and rolling hills in the background, and immediately that is a Western. But it just so happens it's in a zombie apocalypse film, like genre, like Walking Dead. And I think that's the point, is just that kind of, they're quite sort of simple stories on a surface level. They've got quite simplistic themes that are very accessible, but they mean so many different things to different people at different times, depending on how they're used and portrayed and subverted, shall we say. So yeah, I think that's kind of the draw in itself, is that kind of the things that they can do. It's much more interesting.
Do you remember a moment when you became aware that the West you were encountering, be it through some of the films or TV, and I'm sure like in commercials, like these Western tropes, they pop up all over. Was there a point in which you realized that these were built off of mythology, like the mythic West, and somewhat divorced from perhaps historical reality, that got you then thinking about portrayal of the region, mythology, alongside actual history?
I guess, yeah, I couldn't probably pinpoint like a certain aha, but I definitely think it was more. I'd like to say that I was probably more media critical, but I definitely was through like sort of the undergrad study, when we were looking at examples such as sort of Unforgiven and things like that you do realize that there is these texts that pull apart these sort of as you say, like the myths and the iconographies, and challenge like that, and that separation between the history and the sort of myth and reality, shall we say. But yeah, to sort of pinpoint a certain time would be difficult. I guess definitely the sort of the Unforgiven example I given before. But yeah, and I think that's kind of encouraged that kind of, because after that point, then I did this sort of MA thesis on sort of the Preacher series. I don't know if you're familiar with Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon's Preacher, which again in itself isn't necessarily just a Western. It sort of engages with all these different genres, but again is when it uses the American story of like the Western, it's very critical. And yeah, so I think it's a kind of rabbit hole, I guess, once, and I imagine this may resonate with different listeners of the podcast. Everyone who's a sort of Western film historian or a Western scholar perhaps can remember the first time when they engaged with and they kind of realized the wonders of that kind of critical elements and subversive elements that lie within.
Yeah, it's fascinating that the West and some of the mythic West kind of becomes a shorthand that storytellers, be it through film or whatever form of media, they can touch on this thing. Yeah, so you put a cowboy or a guy on a horse in a big landscape, and immediately that serves as shorthand and the audience brings all kinds of assumptions to the table, right? Which a storyteller can then use to reinforce those, or like with Unforgiven and others, they can then actively deconstruct all of those things that people brought to the table. But it's a powerful shorthand for storytelling, which is why I think it just pops up all over the place.
Yeah.
So if we move to comic books. So comic books have their ancestry in illustrations that were found in newspapers and dime novels, in the mid to late 19th century, and then moves into single and then multi-panel comic strips in newspapers, which I was going to say people are familiar with, but maybe the younger generation aren't so familiar with, like the funny pages, in the Sunday paper. But one of the really compelling arguments that you forward in your book is that comics, or this the medium of images plus words, that they haven't been sufficiently credited for being at the center of the formation of the mythic West in popular culture. And there's so many studies on dime novels and Wild West shows or radio, television, film, but comic books, like, they overlap. That they're evolving at the same time as all of those, but not many people have talked about them. Can you talk to us a little bit about what do you think some of the real prominent things in Western mythology, imagery that you can draw back to? Like, comics were key in developing that trope, that storyline, that character, narrative arc, or whatever it is. But what are things that you find most compelling in this argument?
So the thing is as that sort of history of the Wild West, for want of a better word, is being written, we've got those various, that portion of history from the sort of the 1860s onwards. And as that is unfolding in real time, you've got obviously newspapers documenting those moments in history. But simultaneously, you've got sort of cartoonists documenting those moments in word and image forms. So there's a kind of an immediacy to that sort of generation of image production that is unmatched in sort of cinema, for example, which only came about I'm not going to say the correct year, but the late 1890s onwards, you kind of get this formation of sort of Western films, for example. I kind of often find myself playing off the Western comics against other media. So there is that kind of immediacy that as these moments are unfolding, these images are being generated not in real time, but even a matter of days later, a matter of weeks later, you've got an image in a newspaper, drawn image of that moment, completely fictionalized, because typically the artist was never at the scene at the time. In the book, I mention a sort of a quick draw shootout between Wild Bill Hickok and another person. But you've got this visualized, and then of course the kind of the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer's last stand, quote unquote, and the artist wasn't. There was no artist present, but then in newspapers, mere weeks later, you had images of Custer valiantly in battle, in his death throes, and so on. And then you see, in the book, I make this. I think I'm not the first to make this. I forget the scholar's name, but he has done a sort of chapter on sort of the painted and the illustrations of Custer. But you do see that moment in sort of newspaper cartoons before it then gets translated into sort of cinema, into painting. Originally, it's in cartoons. This image of this sort of valiant Custer in battle, and
there might be like a caption, right, like in some explanatory text, but otherwise, if it's a single panel illustration, they have to tell a whole story just through imagery. So the imagery has to be exaggerated. It has to build its own kind of visual vocabulary, which seems to me to be like really fertile ground then for later storytellers to pull back to those like exaggerated images and stuff that these illustrations did, and then the myth starts growing, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the power of the image, because I think a cinema, for example, again, sorry, I keep drawing back to that other novel, they've got pages or they've got time. the image is just that single image. So to get your point across is kind of it might not be a nice image. It's probably something horribly racist, for example, or quite galling. But it is that kind of that's the power of the image, that it can convey all those ideas. Typically, the promotion of sort of white encroachment in the 1900s.
So that's like one message, like promoting or celebrating, American expansion. What are the other messages or views that are embedded in these early illustrations in, like, say, the mid to late 1800s?
I mean, there's also, again, in the book, there's an image of sort of a train heist. So you can almost see these images of, oh my God, this is the Wild West. This is this lawless landscape where, you could be traveling and, desperados can be there and, bandits. So, and there's all sorts of kind of, there's much gentler images. I should sort of probably give the other side, which I don't in the book necessarily, because there's a lot of calmer images just around the kind of agricultural life, and much calmer. But obviously, the point of my book is to sort of link how these sort of exciting, sort of dramatic elements that are unfolding in that region are captured in these images, and these are the kind of the moments that are pulled away and kind of develop a kind of a language, perhaps an iconography, a vocabulary of when we sort of imagine the West. So, as the Western does transfer over to these other popular media, you have those like galloping horses, you have, gunfights, you have a cast of characters almost, you have the sort of, settled community, you might have bandits, for example, outlaws or what have you, gunfighters. And these are all things that are imagined, well, not even like, captured in these cartoons. So I think it's, and not necessarily just cartoons. I do look at things like, book covers as well, which are the gateway to the novel or the piece of fiction you're about to consume. So it was always the sort of the drawn image, I think, is the first kind of visual kind of experience that someone has. And these are things that were kind of, I'm going on a tangent now, but a similar thing to, I think it was more effective perhaps in Europe when you had the sort of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show that would come to Europe. And it was documented in sort of magazine cartoons. It was documented in posters. It was documented in sort of books and book covers. And you would see these images, and these were your first experiences with the Wild West, effectively. So in some senses, because these magazines, again, to draw back to sort of newspaper illustration, which are read in these big cities such as New York and Chicago, these are perhaps some of the first images people would experience of the sort of the Western genre as we know it, or of course the historic West as well.
And these then are going to really steer how people think about the region, how they think about the national project of expansion, of settling the West. This imagery and these myths have a lot of power. And one of the things you mentioned is that it, in some ways, maybe softens or habituated Americans. Habituated, that's a word, I think. I'm pretty sure that's a word.
Yeah,
we'll call it a word.
Yeah.
So how it kind of, it gets Americans used to the violence being perpetrated against indigenous peoples, or gets them used to the idea that, like, they hear of, like, oh yeah, did you hear that cousin so and so went out to Nebraska or wherever, and it was a nightmare, and they came back. Like, habituated to the idea that it's a difficult place, that it's a place where they might fail, but also a place where it might be like wild success, especially with kind of with boosterism and people trying to promote, settlement. But it serves all kinds of these national projects.
And sometimes it's not subtle. I mean, there's one, it was called The True Solution to the awful image, and it's very on the nose, some of these, but it's all the way to sort of naturalize kind of violence, as it were, as you say. And so I think then by the time you get to the turn of the century, it probably is just sort of it's kind of part of the vocabulary of that it goes unquestioned.
Is that the one where it's like Uncle Sam with a scythe?
Yes.
And it says extermination on it, and he's just cutting the Indians down. That is the solution.
It's, for want of a better word, that is the kind of the power of the image. It might not be a nice image, but it's just it's effective in what it wants to achieve, which is to rile up a nation against a group of people, which is
And I mean,
Yeah.
that especially reinforces kind of the vanishing Indian idea that, is going around throughout the late century.
Yes, and I think that's as well is part of that history, is it that how it changes because throughout the sort of the late 1800s, you have these sort of very much kind of the promotion of this sort of violence in the West, but then by the end, it does take this sort of nostalgic kind of morose turn when
Mhm.
there's this realization that I mean, this is, with the Frederick Jackson Turner, the frontier is now closed, and I think it kind of captures the mood of that time, of this idea that this is a way of life that's gone now and it's over, and it's a lot, it's more, it challenges readers in a different way, and we're only talking in the space of 10 years from this
Mhm.
kind of let's get them. This is okay, and to the kind of the more, oh, look what we've done. It's quite interesting in a way. Uh,
You write about that, like, yeah, post 1890-ish era and the rise of kind of more of a sense of nostalgia or longing, and, you talk about how in that era's illustrations, it's starting to be viewed more through the tourist gaze, I think is the phrase you
mm,
used.
so
How does that play out on the page? How does that then feel different or look different as we look at these illustrations and comics?
So it's just it was so striking to me because I mean, it's really hard to get get access to a lot of these titles. But as I was sort of researching, I started to realize that this was a core difference between sort of the Western of fiction and film, which is looking backwards to this past that was no more, as it were, or a long gone time from far away, and very mythologized. Whereas the early comic strips, which were printed in these big eastern cities, such as like New York and Chicago, they were very much focused on the present day, and so they were looking at everyday American life, typically city living, but it kind of pairs or times at this moment when, of course, other media are looking backwards to this American West that was. Whereas what comic strips were doing that was so different was taking these sort of present day city dwelling characters, such as in Gasoline Alley and a comic called Little Jimmy. And it was like, what will happen to these characters that live in, New York City? What happens when they go on vacation to the American West? And it turns out that they go back in, not necessarily in time, not back in time, because we know that these characters are set in present day, but they almost experience this kind of this experience, what cinema was showing of these sort of this way of life, the cowboys and the saloon and so on. Whereas when these characters go to the West, that's what they actually experience. And so it was almost showing or representing this sort of nostalgic look backwards, but in a very different, unusual way, which I thought was so fascinating, just because it pairs so differently with the kind of the other representations of the Western. And obviously cartoons have this license, or comic strips have this license to be, wacky, surreal, uh, cartoonish, for want of a better word, that kind of, so they can kind of exaggerate things in different ways, and they can make these funny scenes that kind of were probably divorced from reality in their own way, but very much evoked that kind of attitude of the time, of this sort of closing of the frontier, and the rise of this modern age, and the big industrial moment in time when this kind of rural way of life had vanished. But not true, I don't think, in a lot of ways, but obviously this was the kind of dominant idiom of the time, and it's just, as I say, sort of, yeah, done so differently. And comics in themselves, as I say, they're kind of marketed very much for like a city dwelling audience, so a lot of illiteracy, so it wasn't necessarily about the words, it was all about the image, and that was kind of the key bit, was the kind of the illustration, which was the thing that sold these sort of stories.
So how does this change when we get into the Great Depression era? How does the medium change, and how does the market for it start to evolve?
So that's when it kind of swings back around, and it does come up to speed with what is happening in things like fiction and film, which is the more kind of a defined narrative of the Western story. And so you get, and especially in this moment of the Great Depression, I think Americans really ideally wanted escapism. So you get these big high adventure genres from science fiction, crime capers, fantasy. And the Western, of course, I mean, it was only sort of removed, if we think, by sort of 40, 50 so years, but already it's kind of been absorbed into this sort of platform of different kind of fantasy genres, should we say, which is quite fascinating in itself. But of course, it's that big emphasis on those sort of, bold heroism, exciting drama, exciting adventure. And for anyone that's unfamiliar with comic strips and newspaper comic strips, it's typically just sort of 4 or 5 panels, sometimes a full page in a newspaper. So you can almost imagine that, where a Western film would, have, multiple scenes of gunfighting, galloping horses, drama. Comic strips only have a few panels to achieve this in. So it kind of really condensed all the exciting bits just onto a page. And I think it is just pure escapism. And in the book, I kind of really drill into, because sometimes the messaging is really clear, like damn the bankers, damn these greedy businessmen taking our money. And it's these clear kind of echoes of what's happening in the surrounding moment of the early 1930s. But from a sort of pure entertainment basis, I think there was this emphasis. Comedy still resonated, so you got a lot of these sort of jokey Western kind of examples, but it was a very dominant kind of adventure moment. And it's just interesting that comic strips were doing something so different only 10 years earlier with these kind of modern day tourist encounters, which were kind of gentle, kind of fun adventures, jokey adventures in the West. But then it took this real pivot to become all about action and adventure for the 1930s. So again, we sort of mentioned that earlier, how Westerns get used and reshaped in different moments in time. And I think comics do that quite nicely, just because they naturally absorb what's the surrounding moment and they can kind of be revised purely at the stroke of the artist's pen, and to me make a meaning of something that would resonate with us readers.
At the same time that you start to see the growth of not just comics, then the actual comic books, right? As we might think of them today, these, serialized, issue 54 of the so-and-so's adventures, whatever it is, right? But the frontier era is past, but say like now we're into like the 1940s and then the post-World War II era, which is really the golden era of Western comics. Maybe the golden era of comics
in general, I'd say.
Broadly.
Yeah.
But the frontier era is past. But these Western tropes and ideas and narratives have been consumed by a lot of people. And there's this mythologized landscape that can now be used to tell stories about the present, right? To tell stories, say, about the Great Depression or about the Cold War. How does this more long form format, what are new kinds of stories or narratives that are able to be told as we move into kind of this mid-20th century era?
This is when it goes a bit bonkers from a scholarly point of view, just because it's huge. There was thousands of titles. So for those unfamiliar with kind of the history of comic books, after World War II, comic books blew up to the point, I think it was 1 year, it was 1 billion issues, individual issues were sold by I think 1954. This was like a huge piece of media that was like part of everyday childhood. I won't read out the percentages off the top of my head because I'll completely get them wrong, but it was pretty much every kid in America read comics, basically, bar some, I'm sure. But that is the point, is that they become this kind of vehicle of, not necessarily, it's similar to the comic strip, weren't just a vehicle for Westerns, but all the different genres, superheroes, crime, romance, and so on. But to sort of appeal, they were very serialized, what's the word? They were formulas. It was kind of whatever formula sold the best was then regurgitated and repeated and so on. And I think that kind of happened with the Western. It proved popular after the war, sort of 1948 onwards. I think publishers realized that it was a really hugely popular adventure genre. The superhero, funnily enough, was waning at that moment in time after the war. People didn't really want these superheroic anymore. They wanted something a bit more based in reality. Actually more of an escape from reality, I should say, because the superheroes were fighting in World War II in comic books. gosh, I'm going to go on a huge tangent here. Focus, Will. But I think publishers wanted a replacement for the superhero, and I think the Westerner or the cowboy naturally kind of filled that gap. But because comics were so formulaic, they were desperate to kind of meet with or speak to whatever was popular. So they tried sort of romance westerns, they tried ghost westerns, supernatural westerns, all sorts of westerns to try and appeal to the sort of biggest sort of readership. And I think at heart, again, it was mainly these sort of adventure stories. And they'd pull in, if there was John Wayne was a popular character in film, so there was a John Wayne series, there was a Gene Autry series, there was a Tom Mix series. So they become vehicles for so many different things. But politically, I think it was clear that westerns kind of blew up after World War II. Primarily because of the Cold War. And I think the Western kind of embodied a lot of that kind of spirit of, American heroism. And so it naturally became this kind of useful vehicle to carry the kind of and promote kind of Cold War ideals and rationales. And that's not unique necessarily to comic books, because films were doing it, for example. But what was interesting about comic books is that they're marketed directly at children. Adults did read them too, but this was largely a space for kids. And so when you're reading these comics, which are very political, at a surface level, good fun, lots of adventure, high adventure, wacky stories. But what was interesting is that these stories were, there was political undercurrents, but these were being consumed directly by and for children, produced for children, which was kind of the most interesting thing I found about them, but they do so in an interesting way. I use this one example of the film Colt 45. I just need to make sure I'm not saying the wrong film title. I think it was Colt 45, the 1950 film. And it's a story about the sort of the revolving pistol and the storyline around keeping this out of the hands of the wrong people, the enemy, because this is a killer of a weapon, and if the enemy got this weapon, they'd win. So, but obviously this is
very very thinly veiled.
So
it's about atomic weapons, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. But what's interesting is that's the sort of the nuance of film, where it's very subtle, but you kind of get it immediately. Whereas comics sometimes don't necessarily have that subtlety. So then you get kind of storylines around cowboys fighting Russian spies. In one comic,
like the swift deer and the Russian bear. This is not subtle. Can you explain this to listeners?
So this is a story. Oh, it's for the image alone. Oh, it's fabulous. And I forget the tribe that the person's associated with. So it's an indigenous American.
Well, it's Utes, but it puts them in California, which is not correct. But it's Utes, yeah.
Utes. So it's a storyline on which a ship of they either come by ship or they just come down through the Arctic. The Russian travelers commonly settle nearby the Ute tribe, and one night one of the men have a nightmare about Joseph Stalin. And he realizes that actually having Russians in the continent is a very bad idea, because in the future Joseph Stalin's around and communism is around, so we can't have.
And there's
Russians.
Like a hammer and a sickle up in the sky that he's in this vision he's seeing, right?
It truly is the stuff of nightmares. And so obviously he wakes up and he tells his friends, "Oh, we need to get these Russians out because Joseph Stalin." And we're talking about early 1800s here, so this is obviously this premonition. He's got a superpower here where he can look into the future, and he knows that we need to get the Russians out, so he incites all of his friends to rise up, and they beat the Russians up and scare them off, and the Russians flee back to their homeland. It's that kind of it's the dream bubble that comes out of his head, and you can see the sort of Joseph Stalin, the hammer and sickle. And again, you would not get that in cinema because you can't achieve that in cinema. But with comics, because it's a hand-drawn medium, it's literally limitless. It's only limited by the creator, who's obviously a bit wacky, because he thought this would be a brilliant idea. But that is the kind of brilliance of comics. And so in that example, it's not very nuanced, but there is a lot more subtle, kind of much more sort of
like in a lot of them, the native peoples are kind of cast in the role of our Cold War enemies as communists.
yes,
Right?
yes.
Can you think of an example, like of a little bit more subtle one in which, say, the native peoples play that bad guy, and so the story that's being told is one about American triumph over communists?
I mean, and that's probably like every.
Okay.
It's in a way, it's quite because I kind of look at. I'm gonna forget the publisher. I do talk about it in the book. I think it's Fox Features Syndicate. They had several series, and the way they draw Indigenous American people in these comics is so. I liken it to horror comics at the time. They're created as like monsters. It's very brutal, very racist. So there's a trigger warning there if you do go and look at it. But it's quite disgusting, but it's quite powerful how they've coded these, villains that they're so treacherous. And every time you get these sort of white, triumphant heroes that come and save the day, and I think that kind of rearticulation of the kind of American triumph. We triumphed back then, and we can triumph again as we did back then. I think it's this kind of this historic. You look backwards to kind of make yourself feel good in the present, maybe. There's it's kind of almost it's incessant. It's constant. And yeah, that was very much a storyline of the comic books at the time. I think that's a kind of a more easier way. That's the sort of softened one. What happens then is they kind of shift that to things like territories like Mexico, and it kind of becomes then so there's these storylines of cowboys then heading south of the border and policing.
Like Two Gun Kid, Prairie Kid.
Yes, yeah.
They go and they have these Central South American adventures, but it's a story of. It's basically saying like. America brought civilization to the West. We've done this once. Look, now here's America going south of the border, and it's chaos and it's violence, and America brings law and order. It's law and order storylines.
Yeah. So
and the message being, so we can do this worldwide now during the Cold War, right?
And then look what happens, because of course you do get these kind of the Cold War policies of where America intervenes in places like Korea, Cuba, later Vietnam, and it kind of naturalizes these ideas that it's okay for America to go beyond its borders to sort of police and make right, shape these other nations that need help in a sort of an American way, as it were. So, and again, to reiterate, these are stories for children, so it's very sort of pernicious, that kind of the subtlety of that messaging. As you read it over time, kind of like I imagine that. I'm sure there's lots of media critical children out there that were like, God, this is terrible. But as well, it's just fascinating that the kind of political ideals and values that are being imparted through these kind of coded sort of storylines.
Yeah, that was a paradox I wasn't really expecting. That this is really heavy geopolitical commentary, and I don't want to say indoctrination or propaganda, but it kind of propaganda, and that it's all of this effort's being spent on sending these messages to kids. I know that with some comics and comic books, and going back further to like dime novels and kind of that industry, it's sometimes hard to know who was writing what. Sometimes it's synonymous. And so, but what I was going to say is it would be fascinating if we had documentary records of like the behind the scenes discussions that the publishers and illustrators were having about, because like it's clearly intentional. Like they're telling Cold War, they're teaching Cold War messages to kids. It'd be really fascinating to see behind the scenes them debating that or discussing that. that documentation just may not exist enough to tell the whole story.
Oh, this is where I become a terrible comic scholar, and any listener would be like shouting, going, "Oh my god!" I do think there is something at the back of my head that thinks that there is a certain linkage between one publisher and the FBI that were kind of, but I shouldn't really go down this route because because people will quote this, but I'm sure there was some. It might be in William Savage's book from 1990 called Comics. Oh, comic book name? Oh no, I can't even remember the title of William Savage's book. Oh, Oklahoma Press, 1990, a comic book history. But there is a chapter, I'm sure, which looks at the linkages between comic book publishing and the FBI. But I do want to say as well, I mean, this is to move beyond that, is that the shoe on the other foot is that all these stories weren't necessarily to promote kind of American idea, very traditional ideals and values, that the comics could be subversive. And I think that's the other sort of strand to all of this, is that you have this kind of very political material that's kind of shaping kind of a positive American viewpoint around American activity during the Cold War. But you also get, which is again equally as fascinating, these sort of very subversive, critical kind of stories, maybe critical of American Cold War politics, maybe critical of the history of the West. Again, projected and directed at children.
And this is before kind of the 1960s, 70s,
oh, yes,
like full counterculture, critique. Like earlier than that, you have concurrent in like the 40s, 50s Cold War, you have there's critiques coming through, kind of critiquing what this consensus America philosophy. Can you think? Do you have any favorite examples of some of those early ones that are deconstructing this a little bit?
I think the one that's most easily ready of like the one that always jumps to mind are the ones by EC Comics. And for those that are unfamiliar, EC made the kind of name on these kind of radical kind of violent horror comics, crime comics. Mad Magazine, which again was this kind of very, I think that's a more Mad Magazine's still going, right?
It was when I was a kid. I don't know if it's still a thing.
But it's, again, it kind of hopefully will conjure it in people's minds that may be listening.
Like satire.
But they did a series of anti-war comics from the sort of 1950 to 1954 called Two-Fisted Tales and... can't remember the other one, but if you Google it, this is my plea to listeners. But they did very much embedded within these anti-war stories. A lot of it was very much anti-war sort of kind of stories set in sort of World War II and so on. But embedded within these issues, you'd also have sort of anti-war kind of messaging around sort of Western history. So there was definitely a comic about Custer's Last Stand, which was told from the perspective of one of the sort of soldiers that fought and died during that battle, and it's a kind of a monologue that's told in first person, and it's all about how it's a kind of quite a sad story about, because I think the soldier is aware that he's about to die because obviously this battle's not going their way, but he almost celebrates the death of Custer, which is quite a kind of a striking moment in this kind of because he sees Custer get hit and fall and die, and it just ends with he's dead, I'm glad, and it's this kind of celebration of Custer's sort of death, which is kind of for 1950s and a comic book aimed at children, I think is quite kind of radical in some ways, I guess. And then other stories, there's one called Geronimo, which tells the life of that. I think he was an Apache,
yeah.
But again, emphasizing the struggles he had to go through, throughout his life. So it's kind of a history told from the sort of indigenous perspective, again, which is quite interesting from the time, because if you look at sort of westerns of that era, it's all very much of sort of the sort of white settlers, I guess. So
comic books are a little ahead of the curve,
yes,
in some aspects, because you don't start seeing subversive Western films. There probably were some small ones, but not as like a major thing that people are going to watch until really this
60s,
60s,
70s,
70s.
yeah.
So how does this all ramp up then during the era of Vietnam, the era of the civil rights movement, the Red Power movement? How do these comic books shift again then?
I think it was kind of easy in a way for comics because they always had that license to be a bit more subversive and go under the critical radar. And so the key difference was that the comics readers of the 50s by the 1960s had grown up. So if you were a kid reading comics in the 50s, you were probably either a teenager or a young adult in the 1960s and 1970s. So you're still reading comics, but the content is grown up as well. And obviously you've got this surrounding kind of, political backdrop. You've got, as you mentioned before, sort of civil rights and the Vietnam War and so on. And so comics begin, again, unsurprisingly, begin to absorb that kind of political, social climate and begin to kind of, it manifests in the Western. So you get a lot more kind of, critical. And again, that's, I guess, not unique to comics in some ways, because you do see it in cinema and you do see it in fiction as well. And this is that moment when I guess the Western has become unpalatable for many. The kind of then the sort of the traditions of it, it can't function in the same manner anymore. And so but I think because comics have always had that license, as I say, to be a bit more critical, it almost seemed natural. And so in the book, I kind of look at the different ways that it sort of engages with the sort of surrounding politics. They're definitely trying to curry the favor of kind of this radical student kind of readership, shall we say. So it might be that it's a Western story told from a black African-American cowboy with Lobo.
I think was one. Yeah.
So, and of course it didn't do very well at the time, but still I think it stands, and it didn't sell well, but as a kind of an historical document, it very much captures that moment. I think the first comic ends with that quote, "Men like Lobo don't deserve to be forgotten, for they were there." And that it's really quite powerful kind of statement of this visionary sort of take on this sort of the history of the West in this moment when the West is kind of falling in on itself, because it's become, like, as I say, unpalatable. You get, in other way, I think basically publishers were trying to find what would appeal to a readership, so they're trying these kind of different heroes. So you've got Lobo, you've got Red Wolf in Marvel, which is again, and he fights for justice for all. So he does lots of adventures where he's beating up bad guys. Then DC were trying a bit more kind of, they went a bit more adult. So they had things like Batlash, who was much more interested in, making out with women. And that usually got him in trouble. And that's why the sheriff was usually chasing him, is because he kissed his wife maybe or something. It was a bit more cheeky. Or you got things like Jonah Hex, which kind of absorbed a lot more of the spirit of the kind of spaghetti westerns, of those more kind of violent westerns that were kind of being produced by people like Sam Peckinpah. So you get these very much more aggressive and gritty kind of westerns.
But like those ultra violent ones like Jonah Hex or Rawhide Kid, do you read those then as like a critique on the violence of the Vietnam era, that like America has become too desensitized to just wanton massacres and bloodshed?
Yes, and I think within the remit as well, because I think one thing I've kind of not touched upon, but I mean, there's so much to discuss, is comics do get censored in the mid-50s, so they're still kind of straight-laced a little bit by censorship rules. But within what they can realistically achieve, you do get a lot more violence coming through. And then I even touch upon a comics page from Jonah Hex in particular, and it's he goes to visit friends at an Indigenous American village, and he sees that they've all been slaughtered by a group of like men from a nearby sort of town. And of course, the image of this pile of dead bodies can't not be read with the sort of stare of the sort of Mile High Massacre, which happened maybe a year before. And obviously, you've got that news reportage of all those dead bodies from that kind of particular event kind of mirrored into the comics form. Although the point I make, because it's not necessarily unique to comics, because you had things like Soldier Blue and Little Big Man, which films that were doing the same thing, taking those images from Vietnam and kind of mirroring them in some way cinematically. But I think what's interesting about comics is the kind of stillness of the image, whereas like film unspools and it disappears and the next scene arrives. Comics have that kind of presence because it's the image and you choose how long you rest on that image. And so there's kind of much more power, I was trying to argue, from that kind of printed moment that you have with each comics page, shall we say. So again, it was doing a similar thing to what other media were doing at the time, but just doing so in a different way. And I think it kind of finds its kind of most grotesque kind of output. I can't think of the correct word, but I look at Jack Jackson, an underground cartoonist, and his comic Nits Make Lice, which came out in 1975. And again, it was doing a similar thing, but as underground comics go, they just unrestrained in the kind of the violence, the gore, the sex that they depict, and so it gets quite horrible. I think to the point where you probably don't need to necessarily see those images, but interestingly, at the time, there was a review of one film. I quote it in the book, and it's this idea that, we need to see these images so we can look back at the past and learn from it. And I almost wonder if that's it's getting a kind of out of hand. We don't necessarily need to see that kind of richly detailed depth of an image of, someone getting stabbed in the stomach, slit open, which is so gruesomely depicted in these sort of comics. But I wonder if that was kind of almost the direction of what people, I don't know, it almost felt like that was it plateaued at that point. I think there's nowhere else you can go, as it were. And I think that's what happens, because I don't want to say the Western died, because everyone who's listening as scholars of the West knows that the Western doesn't die in the 1970s, but it definitely has to change, I think, fundamentally at that point.
But it's interesting that comics and comic books, like, there's less of a capital investment by the publisher, the illustrator. Like, it doesn't cost as much, so they can go out on limbs and push the genre and the narratives like way to the extreme, and then scale back if that didn't go over well, in ways that film, which that's a lot of money, and so films often aren't, or maybe they are, but it's often more underground cinema that again really pushes those extremes, whereas the mainstream stays a little more mainstream. I think another thing that was really interesting that you bring out is that it's not just during this era that there's stories being told from different perspectives, say like Black or Native American protagonists, youth protagonists in some of these, but also that some of the stock characters start to really look different. So, the cowboy, the lawman, instead of he is maybe cowardly instead of brave, racist and sexist and immoral instead of like the virtuous, protector of law and order, and Indians as intelligent and noble instead of mindless and violent. Women are often depicted as active agents instead of just the helpless damsel in distress. There's all kinds of ways in which all these stock Western characters are being kind of flipped on their head and deconstructed during the 60s, 70s era.
And I think it goes, again, back to what I was saying at the beginning of this conversation, was around the kind of simplicity of the image. We all know the Western, we know those different iconographies, those different myths. And so it's just so easy to take them and break them, and for the audience to kind of see that and pick up on that. And sort of, I kind of think we can kind of get into it a bit, especially at that moment in time, when there is sort of, feminism and natural ecology and all these different kind of ideals that we're developing or being foregrounded, should we say. And so I think it gives a new currency to the Western, but I think as well, it has to fundamentally change because it can't deliver in the same way. And I think that's why, as you move past the sort of 70s, you see that done so more so with, kind of, it might be like women taking the lead, or, it might be a story told from like a Native American perspective, should we say? So yeah, there's definitely, but yeah, you do see that manifest or start to manifest, shall we say, in the sort of the 60s and the 70s.
So in 1974, film critic Pauline Kael, is it pronounced?
I'm going to say yes because that's how I
We'll
pronounce
say
it.
Kael. Okay. She said that like that the Western, and she's talking about film here, but that the Western is dead. And, obviously she was wrong. I mean, it has declined. It's not as ubiquitous, but it's still, it's a currency that storytellers play in. And we start to see it in all kinds of, like Star Wars is a space Western, right?
Yes.
Or like The Mandalorian, like even, I mean, The Mandalorian like really leaned into, it was not subtle in how much of a Western it was. But like you already mentioned Preacher, The Walking Dead, like the genre has taken on new forms and is being adapted by other genres, but it hasn't gone away. So I'm curious, so comic books largely marketed to youth. They were doing some very subversive work, and they continue to. But do you think that like the youth market is why did people not take them seriously as a cultural critique? And I mean, at the time and beyond that, scholars as well haven't thought about them as much as they should. But do you think like that the youth marketing of it has really undercut like how seriously they were taken?
I think so. And I think this is kind of going off a tangent, but it's basically the scholarship that addresses spaghetti westerns. I'll come back to the question, you'll see. But spaghetti westerns, for some film critics at the time when these were released in the 1960s, they were, by American critics, they were like, oh, these are not like the traditional West that we create here in the United States. These are very comic book. And the term comic
like
book
as a slur that was derogatory.
Is so, because they're so unserious. These are comic book westerns, and that could, I assume, because again they don't sort of go into more depth around why they've used the term comic book, but it's clear that these are unserious. The violence is silly, so it's comic book like. The characters are bizarre. They're comic book. So and I think that kind of the term comic book is very and I think so. Anyway, to swing back now, and I think that there is that attitude of kind of, again, it's more of a feeling than someone's, I could probably quantify or qualify it, but I think it is that sense that because these are sort of, this is child's literature, and a similar thing happens in comic studies. I think it's very much, it's only really starting to grow in the last so many decades, because comics have always been considered this sort of child's literature that's unserious. It's not, it's throwaway, it's pulpy, and I wonder if that's kind of always why it's been dismissed in a way. And so it allows the things to, so when I was talking about these kind of political critical stories, because they're comics, no, I don't think they were necessarily given the same kind of as you say, that same critical attention. But yes, I think things are starting to change now, and I think that might be a readership thing, because comics aren't just for children anymore. And I think so I think that allows for a lot of different types of stories that they can tell. So,
do you think this comic book-ishness of comic books is part of what's contributed to the Western being so resilient as a genre that people play with, doing like very traditional Westerns, but also they play with in sci-fi? And how did the comic book contribution lead to that resilience or the continued interest or usage of Western tropes?
Do you know, it's quite interesting, because I'm not, to be fair, I wanted to develop this in the conclusion, because you do see the influence of comic books there now. I mean, so things like The Walking Dead, and that is a comic book originally, and it is, I think, comics, because they're drawn, they naturally can pull in all these different references as with just the stroke of the artist's pen, and so you do get a lot more texts now these days, which may draw upon the sort of the cowboy iconography, or a theme that's so intrinsic to the West, where it's sort of absorbed and embedded and blended within a sort of a genre mashup, and it kind of becomes unquestioned in some ways. But it's very comic booky or comic bookish, shall we say? And I think that's kind of the element of fun and the kind of it's not trapped by kind of the sort of photorealistic world of cinema, shall we say? Or I think it kind of some of these things go unquestioned in comic books because it is very. I like the term, let's say, comic bookish. It's kind of it can be what you want it to mean, but in this sort of case, it's quite a fluid. It's a world of possibilities.
Well, I'm really excited about this work. I love the book. I'm excited about having my students think, like coming up with some assignments to have them use, illustrations and comics and comic books to think critically about, especially about like the mythic West and how the West has been depicted. But I really hope that this is picked up by others but as you say, there's this difficulty of finding and accessing. I mean, there are probably so many that we will never see. They're lost to time, which is unfortunate. But I really hope that people pick up on this work and integrate it into how they're thinking about the region and its history.
Oh, thank you. Me too. Because it felt like a lonely thing when I was doing it. I started, it may have been sort of 2009, 2010, and there was not really anyone. But over time, you do see pockets of, scholars. I mean, Chris Conway and Antoinette Saul released a book recently called The Comic Book West, which kind of, brought together various scholars that obviously were researching the West. And so there's people out there, and again, I've been to conferences throughout the last sort of 10 years, and I've met people doing different studies, not necessarily on American comics, but comics from sort of francophone kind of comics, comics from Mexico, from sort of Nordic regions. It might have been, I can't remember the country. But the point is that I think there is a lot of scholarship going on, and I think that's the kind of the direction maybe next is probably looking at kind of these sort of global Western comics, because again, this isn't a sort of a bombshell, but of course, we know that sort of the Western was picked up and used and resonated in different sort of cultures and contexts. But of course, Western comics, because it's just pen and paper, these drawn sort of Western stories, they're everywhere throughout the 20th century, particularly. And again, I think there's a massive area there that's it's still waiting to be scratched.
So is this, I was going to ask what you're doing next. Is this where you're headed, looking at the global?
Partially, yeah. So I'm writing this chapter at the minute. I'd like to, again, because similar to what Chris and Antoinette Saul achieved with the Comic Book Western is to collect all these voices that I've met across, these people I've met across the years, because I think there's still so much more research out there that does need to come together, and someone needs to shine a spotlight on it. But yeah, so what I'm writing at the moment is kind of a theory that's untested, so I'm waiting for my editor to read it and go, this is horrible, or this, you're onto something. But my theory is that the Western was always a stand-in in Europe for kind of the empire narrative, these colonial narratives. You had these sort of adventurers in exotic landscapes. But as a stand-in, it had in comic books, these sort of anthology titles. You'd have a crime caper, you'd have a medieval fantasy, you'd have a Western, and you'd have these sort of empire narratives. And so these Westerns, as I say, were sort of a stand-in for these kind of colonial ideals of Europe. But as we know in America, through the post-Western and studies of the post-Western, we understand that the Western kind of soured in this moment of, the late 20th century, on the back of postmodernism, postcolonialism, multiculturalism, ecology, feminism. And I'm trying to sort of point out how a similar thing is happening in European comics of the sort of 1980s and onwards. At this moment of decolonization, postmodernity, you've got comics creators creating these kind of very critical westerns that are taken out of the context of the sort of the 19th century and plonked in a post-apocalyptic world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm trying to add a transnational dimension to the post-Western. But I need someone to read that and go, hang on, you've not thought of this, or you need to look at this instead. But I do see a pattern here that there is a kind of post-Western trend in European comics of the late 20th century. But again, completely overlooked, because when we look at the post-Western, we think of the post-Western, we think of how it has been changed and shaped and redirected in sort of the context of the United States. So this, that's where I'm at anyway. So, we'll see. But again, I'm very much fascinated. I wish I was multilingual, as I'd be writing chapters on every single Western comic around the world ever. But I do probably need the help of others. But for now, I'm looking at this sort of a sample of comics from Europe, such as 2000 AD, Hombre from Spain, and Jeremiah from Belgium. So we'll see.
Well, that sounds great. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I wish you the best of luck on this future work. It sounds really good.
Oh, brilliant. No, thank you for having me. This is really, it's been really cool. And I honestly, I'm a new fan of this podcast. In the last week, I've listened to several episodes, and I look forward to listening to lots more as well. So no, it's been brilliant. No, thank you. So.
Yeah, you're welcome. And thanks for spending some time. Hopefully we'll meet sometime in person. Well,
yes, when I drive through Provo. Next time I drive through Provo, I will pay a visit. It's a shame we had to get a flight from Salt Lake City the next day. So we were on a mission. But it was brilliant. I loved Utah. Don't agree with the speed limit. 80 miles per hour is nuts. I don't know why.
Oh, too fast, huh?
Why? Got us through the state very quick, though. We'll say that. But, sorry, I hope you cut this bit out, because I don't think the listeners need to know my thoughts on the Utah speed limits. But
this is the best part. This is definitely staying in.
It was like I'd love to go back. It was fabulous. So, but
well, drop me a line when you do.
Definitely, cool.
Thanks for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, and follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast, or on X or Twitter at Writing West. There you can get updates and leave comments and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic and public research and promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream on our YouTube and Facebook pages, have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD Center. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is also linked in the show notes. As you know by now, my name is Brendan Rensing, and since I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else for the podcast, you can direct praise or critique my work. As a historian, I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, the environment, and other topics. My most prominent publications include a 2018 book, Native but Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America, a 2019 anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I also recently launched and will be editing a new series for the University of New Mexico Press entitled Histories of the North American West. So send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website that curates student-researched and written micro-histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about that project, the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's bwrensink.org. Email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on X Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well.